Hello and welcome to another edition of our Meet the Managers webinar. My name is Dale Jandu and I'm a financial planner here at Ethical Investing New Zealand. Today you'll be hearing directly from the good folks at Betashares, who are a fund manager based in Australia and make up part of our Sustainable Portfolio series. We're lucky enough to have Vinnie Wadhera join us live in the office and Greg Liddell joining us remotely from Australia. Shortly, Vinnie will be giving us an introduction to Betashares and Greg will go through their approach to responsible investing. Everyone watching live will be on mute, and you can ask questions through either the Q&A or chat function at the bottom of your screen. We'll pick these questions up later in the presentation. This webinar is for information only, so if you would like some more personalised advice, please feel free to get in contact with us directly, and we'll be more than happy to help. So without further delay, I'll pass over to you, Vinnie.
Thank you so much, Dal. And thank you to Dal and the team at Ethical Investing New Zealand for inviting us along and sharing a little bit about Betashares and our approach to responsible investing. So as Dal mentioned, I head up our advisor and institutional services. So I work with groups like Ethical Investing across Australia and New Zealand. And Greg is our Director of Responsible Investing. In terms of Betashares, and on the next slide, just a few high-level points on Betashares. We're a fund manager that specialises in mostly exchange-traded funds, ETF, but we've recently also launched some New Zealand domicile PI funds also. We have in excess of 27 billion under management with over 130 staff across Australia and New Zealand. We're very excited to be the first time having some local New Zealand funds also. One of the key differentiators of Betashares is, particularly on the ETF side, is that we've brought a lot of innovation for investors and advisors in terms of new approaches to passive investing, different exposures that can be added to portfolios. And on the next slide, in terms of responsible investing, we at Betashares are a pioneer and have a leadership role with responsible investing. We are a signatory to the United Nations Principle of Responsible Investment, so PRI. We're also a member of the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia. We dedicate a lot of resources, which Greg, you'll hear from in a moment, is focused on company voting and company engagement with the companies that we have in our portfolios. And across our responsible investing suite, there is in excess of 5 billion in terms of assets, New Zealand dollar assets. So we are trusted by a very wide range of investors for responsible investing. I will share a little bit about the fund that Dal has asked us to focus on, which is our Global Sustainable Leaders ETF and fund. It'll be a PI fund shortly. The team here at Ethical Investing New Zealand have spent quite some time in terms of researching and reviewing Betashares and this fund, and I think in many cases have recommended this to many of their clients yourselves. So this is a global shared portfolio that has gone through some very stringent screening, both positive and negative screening. Now we might just go to the next slide in terms of the high-level overview of this, and this really does encompass the philosophy we have at Betashares in delivering a portfolio that is true to label. A lot recently has been written about responsible funds that are not true to label, but we set out to do a few things. Firstly, to create a true to label portfolio, and also one that is very prescriptive in terms of the decisions for stocks that go in or out. Again, at Betashares, being a passive investor, we work on constructing a very stringent set of rules, and then we focus on sourcing data and input to support that rules-based process. So we're being as prescriptive as possible, we're being as transparent as possible in terms of the rule and also the end portfolio. So a high-level overview is we start with the universe of global stocks. We identify those stocks that are climate leaders in terms of carbon emissions, that they're superior compared to their peers in that industry. We'll apply some practical investment screens in terms of liquidity and capitalisation of stock. That's very important in terms of when we move stocks around in terms of liquidity. And then we apply some very stringent negative exclusion screens. Greg will go into some details on this, but at a high level, and again, we're being as prescriptive as possible. So we're not making judgment calls. This is the set of rules that we have in place before we come to the end portfolio of 200 stocks. And Dale, if you go to the next slide, this really does encompass the type of activities that we screen out for. We have so you can see firstly the breadth of screens that we have, the activities that we screen for, and then also the depth to which we screen for too. And again, this comes back to the Betashares philosophy of customizing these processes rather than just licensing indices. So in terms of the exclusions, you can see that any company involved in not just the production, but we go the next step and look at revenues that companies generate. So any company involved in either generating revenue from any of those activities on the left-hand side is out. That's not a judgment call. That's part of the rules. We also capture revenues too. So a very good example here, Dal, is that the big four banks in Australia are screened out of the Australian Sustainable Leaders Fund because they presently breach the fossil fuels indirect screen. That is the revenues that they generate from lending to mining companies. Some other areas of interest here, which are very important to investors, are things like human rights, supply chain, and animal cruelty. Again, we're not making judgment calls there. We will source industry reports, and if those industry reports demonstrate that those companies are violating those activities or they're involved in those activities, then they'll be screened out of the portfolio. But I'll pause there in terms of the high-level overview of Betashares and our approach to responsible investing as it relates to the global fund. And I'll hand over to Greg to talk a little bit about more detail in terms of particularly the recent rebalance and the companies that came in and out of the portfolio. So Greg, over to you.
Thank you for that. If we can just go to the next slide, which just shows the performance. I won't go a great deal into performance, but you do find people in the industry who sometimes make the claim that to invest ethically, you have to give up performance. The long-term performance of Ethi shows that you can actually invest in a manner which is consistent with your values and not forego performance. The performance, the long-term track record of Ethi has been very good. If you go to the next slide on the rebalance, one of the things that is quite different about Betashares as a passive manager is that if we cannot find an off-the-shelf index which achieves an investment objective, we'll work with index providers to build one. And in the global ethical investing space, that was the case. We couldn't find something which we thought was genuinely true to label. So we worked with NASDAQ to build the Global Sustainability Leaders Index, and that is the index which Ethi tracks. One of the major differences between that index and other indices is the role of a responsible investment committee. Responsible Investment Committee is made up of myself as chair and two other independent experts in the area of responsible investing. And their role is to oversee the application of the index construction rules. So every year in May, the NASDAQ provides us with what is effectively the list of securities which are eligible for inclusion in the index. And the RIC provides oversight on that to ensure each and every one of those companies actually meets the index construction rules. This year, at the rebalance, 35 companies came into the index and 35 companies left the index. ETHI is rules-based, and most of the additions and deletions from the index were straightforward. Companies make improvement in their carbon intensity and force their way into the index. Others fall out because their market cap has decreased, or they've been taken over, or for some reason or another they don't make the starting universe. In a small number of cases, the Responsible Investment Committee decides that a company should be excluded on the basis of ESG concerns. This year, those companies included UBS. UBS was forced by the Swiss government to acquire Credit Suisse after Credit Suisse ran into some difficulties. Credit Suisse is Europe's largest lender to the coal mining industry, and on that basis, UBS became no longer eligible for inclusion in the portfolio. Interestingly, I was talking to some folk from the UBS sustainability team on Tuesday, and they were talking about the cultural differences between UBS and Credit Suisse. And some folk at UBS aren't particularly happy to be taking on that Credit Suisse loan book. The RIC also decided to exclude H&M on the basis of controversy. You probably all realise H&M is a fast fashion company, and you may remember that after the collapse of Rana Plaza in Bangladesh in 2013. Lots of fashion labels made pledges to improve the safety and working conditions and to pay workers a living wage. There have been a few reports recently, most notably by Oxfam, that a number of companies have not honoured those pledges. In fact, conditions in many fast fashion supply chains have deteriorated, and as has the instances of child labour and modern slavery. You add to that the fact that H&M is being prosecuted in both Europe and the US for greenwashing. We did attempt to engage with H&M over these issues, and they declined to talk to us. So the ROC made a decision to exclude that company from the portfolio. On the additions side, some of the names to note include Salesforce, which last year moved to 100% renewable energy across its operations. The Risk Analytics, which sold off its oil and gas services division, and Keysight Technologies, which has pivoted away from its business away from military contracting. Another company that came into the portfolio was Shoals Technologies Group. In ETHI, one of the things that we built into the rules is the inclusion of 5 companies on the basis of what is referred to as Scope 4 or avoided emissions, which are things like renewable energy, electric vehicles, energy efficiency. Shoals Technology provides what's called balance of system solutions for renewable energy projects. That means, for example, when you build a large solar installation, Shoals do everything except supply the solar panels. So the frames, the wiring, the tracking, the inverters, the meters, the monitoring. As a passive manager, Betashares is not about trying to pick winners. We don't do that. But as you can imagine, in the US, with the Inflation Reduction Act supporting the build out of clean energy to the tune of US $500 billion, we think that there is a tailwind that will benefit companies like Shoals. The other Scope 4 companies in ETHI are Infineon, which is a semiconductor business that spun out of the German company Siemens and manages products which are used in the production and transition of renewable energy. First Solar, which is one of the world's largest manufacturers of solar panels. Enphase, who manufacture microinverters, which increase the efficiency of solar panels. And Vestas, which is the world's largest wind turbine manufacturer. If we can just go to the next slide on stewardship. So in terms of responsible investment, one of the we are a passive manager, which means that we generally hold companies for a long period of time, and we're able to build relationships with those companies. Stewardship is an important part of what we do. That means engaging with companies and voting proxies in the best interest of our investors. As mentioned previously, one of the things that we've been doing over the last 12 months is engaging with fast fashion names around their commitment to pay a living wage and provide workers with a safe working condition. Apple is a company we engage with on a fairly regular basis. As a large company with complex supply chains, Apple frequently has issues. What's important with companies like Apple is how they respond to and manage those issues. During COVID, the Chinese government implemented tough quarantine rules to ensure factories kept operating. One supplier to Apple, Quanta Computer, located in Shanghai, implemented even tougher conditions. They prevented workers from returning to their dormitories to rest. And we saw videos posted on social media of violent clashes between Quanta Computer workers and security guards during protests in relation to prolonged lockdown and low pay. So we engaged with Apple over those issues. We also engaged with Apple over some of the apps that they're hosting. They host apps on behalf of the Myanmar military, which contribute to the persecution of the Rohingyas. And they have an app, or they previously had an app. They've now taken it down, but it was effectively a platform for the trade in modern slavery in the Middle East. Another company that we've engaged with recently is one of those Scope 4 companies, Infineon. Infineon manufactures chips, and some of those chips turned up in weapons, drones and such like, being used by the Russian military in Ukraine. And we had a conversation with Infineon about the steps that they're taking to prevent that. Unfortunately, when they deliver chips to some of their distribution agents, they previously were not tight enough in their controls about what happens to those chips, and they've tightened those things up in the last 12 months. We do engage with companies outside of our ethical suite of products. Over the last 12 months, two of the more high-profile engagements have been with AGL, where we went public. AGL is an energy, electricity and gas utility in Australia, and happens to be Australia's largest emitter of CO2. They had proposed a demerger of their retail and generation businesses, and we went public in our opposition to that demerger, and our support of a refresh of the board there, which did occur. And recently with Woodside, alongside one of the Australian industry super funds, Vision Super, we supported an Australasian Council of Corporate Responsibility proposal to vote against 3 sitting directors after that board ignored shareholder concerns from the previous year in relation to climate change transition risk. If we move to the next slide, as Vinnie mentioned, one of the things that is fundamental to Betashares is the principle of transparency. We don't hide anything from our investors. We publish the rules that govern the construction of the indices we track. We publish our holdings daily. We publish details of our engagement activity annually in our stewardship report, and we publish every proxy that we vote. We provide investors with collateral, including dedicated fund pages, which for Ethy includes information on sustainability performance, and each year we publish a rebalance summary. if you go to the last slide there, this is just a little bit about our ethical and responsible investment range. Ethi is one of a number of products in our range of ethical and responsible investment funds. We classify our funds according to a modified international naming convention, which was established by the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia and its overseas affiliates. Our ethical suite includes Ethi, our global shares, our diversified global shares ethical fund, FAIR, which is our Australian shares ethical fund, GBND, which combines a portfolio of Australian ethically screened fixed interest securities with a global green bond portfolio. And we also have a range of diversified ethical funds. We currently have one impact fund, which is Earth, which invests in companies contributing to the decarbonisation of the economy. And our range of ethically, as for sustainability themed products, includes Drive, which invests in electric vehicles, TAN, which invests in solar energy, IEAT, which is the future of food, it invests in sustainable food technology, and XMET, which invests in the metals and materials which are critical to the transition to zero emissions. I'll finish up there and see if there's any questions.
That's great. Thank you, Greg. I'm just really good to hear about that, and particularly about the breadth and depth of your solutions. That's really good. I'm sure our viewers and clients would enjoy that. But one question just with regards to the removals and the additions to the portfolio. That 35 on your last rebalance, is that about typical, that number?
No, that was a little bit higher than usual. Not a lot higher than usual, but a little bit higher than usual. One of the things that drives that, one of the things that we're seeing, probably after a few years of not seeing enough, is actually real action on companies reducing their emissions. So there is kind of a race to the top, as it were, on carbon efficiency. And we've seen companies like Salesforce actually make a commitment and implement 100% renewable energy. So that change in carbon data is driving a little bit of the increased turnover this year.
So, thank you. And it looks like we've got a couple of questions just come through, so I'll just read those through. So aside from H&M, are you finding boards or companies taking ESG more seriously and therefore help to improve the engagement of companies and wider universe of companies to choose from?
Yes, and that's being driven by two things, I think. One is regulators all around the world are cracking down on greenwashing. And what we're seeing is that it doesn't matter which jurisdiction you're in, whether or not it's New Zealand or Europe. The US is a little bit of a laggard, but certainly in Australia we've seen 35 prosecutions for greenwashing in the last 12 months. So companies know now that if they make sustainability claims, they need to back up those claims with actions, and they're happy to talk to investors about that. The laggards are, of course, the fossil fuel companies, particularly the oil and gas companies. But even those you've seen companies like BP, Shell, and Chevron actually set emission reduction targets, which would have been unheard of as recently as 5 years ago.
Yeah, certainly greenwashing is something that our clients are really mindful of in New Zealand as well. So we get asked quite a bit around that. So we need to make sure we're quite transparent, and then that's one of the good things I like about your approach is the transparency that you have.
Yeah, we we go to a lot of effort to make sure that we say what we do and that we do what we say, and that's something that's pretty embedded in the DNA at Betashares long before I got there, So
That's great. Now that'll obviously continue. Another question that's come through. Are you finding much of a difference in the update of ethical investments between Australia and New Zealand?
I might let Vinnie answer that one.
I'll jump in. I'll jump in because I've been working with advisors like yourselves for many years here, even before we launched our local New Zealand funds, and it's been interesting. The not just the interest, but the level of review and detail has been a lot more thorough from New Zealand investors and advisors. Australian advisors and there's always been a cohort of advisors focused in this space, but it certainly our observation is that ESG and responsible investing is a lot more widely adopted here in New Zealand. It is becoming more in Australia, so that's an interesting observation. And look, we've certainly got we've had strong support in our Australian ETFs for some time from New Zealand investors, including institutional investors. But with the launch of the fund, there's been overwhelming interest.
That's good. It's good to see.
Yeah, that's a good question on Russia that's just popped up there. Of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine highlighted a lot of vulnerabilities in Europe, particularly in Germany, around energy security. And what we've seen since that invasion. The wonderful thing about wind and solar, of course, is that you don't need a pipe from another country to get your energy. And we've seen most of Europe, and particularly Germany, bring forward their plans to decarbonise their energy use. So massive investments in renewable energy, and we've also seen the same. It's hard to overstate how important the Inflation Reduction Act in the US is to sustainable investing around the world. One of the things, we can't ignore geopolitics. And one of the things that we've seen over 10 years is China has become dominant in renewable energy. They make the most panels, they make the most batteries for electric vehicles, they make the most electric vehicles, and they control transition metals and rare earths, which are critical there. The US and Europe have finally woken up to the fact that they are vulnerable. And we've seen with the Inflation Reduction Act, and recently there's been a number of bilateral agreements between the US and countries like Australia in terms of security of supply chains. And so what we're actually seeing is this massive push to make up for lost ground, for ground that's been lost for China, to China. So yes, there has been more change in terms of renewable energy in the last 12 months than we've seen in the previous 10 years.
So I'll just see, I don't think we've got any other questions that come through. So thank you, Vinnie and Greg, for making yourself available. It's been great. And, Vinnie, I know you only just recently flew in, so to pop in the office and be here in person is absolutely fantastic for us.
No, you're very welcome, and thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a really good session, and I'm sure our viewers would have enjoyed it. To all of you that have dialed in live, thank you. And for those who are going to watch the recording afterwards, thank you for that too. We certainly look forward to hosting you on our next webinar in our Meet the Manager series. Until then, take care.
Thank you.
Bye.